You ever seen a man trade his own wife and child for less than the price of a mule? I have. It happened under a sky that didn't blink, and in a town that forgot how to care. She didn't cry. The boy didn't beg. And the man who stepped forward, he didn't say much, just handed over a wedding band and walked away with two strangers who didn't know whether to trust him or run. That ain't how most stories start. But in the West, the broken find each other in quieter ways through silence, grit, and the kind of kindness that don't ask for nothing in return. This ain't about rescue. It's about rebuilding when no one thinks you should. About finding something worth staying for when the world's only ever told you to leave. What would you have done? Tell me your thoughts in the comments. Now let's see how that story unfolds. The dust of the hastily assembled auction block in the heart of what barely passed for a town seemed to settle on Ilara's spirit, a gritty film dulling the sharp edges of her despair. She stood, a woman dispossessed, her 5-year-old son, Caleb, clinging to her worn skirt, his small face buried in its folds. Beside them, the man who had once called her wife, and who now called her chattel, gestured with a flourish that ill-suited the grim proceedings. He was selling his past, and with it, her future. Ilara was with child again, a truth that settled heavy in her womb, a silent counterpoint to the auctioneer's shrill cry. She offered no pleas, no tears. Her gaze, steady and unyielding, swept over the leering, the curious, and the merely indifferent faces in the sparse crowd. A hardness had settled in her eyes, a shield forged in the fires of betrayal and necessity. It was a look that dared them, yet expected nothing. Then, a figure detached itself from the shadowed doorway of the general store. A man, lean and weathered as the high plains themselves, stepped into the pale sunlight. He was no one Ilara recognized from this rough settlement, yet there was a familiarity in the set of his shoulders, in the way he moved with a quiet economy that spoke of years spent in wide, empty spaces. He was, to the onlookers, a stranger. To Ilara, as his face became clear, he was a ghost from a life she thought long buried. Josiah, his voice, when it came, was low, cutting through the merchant's patter. What's the price for the woman and the boy? The merchant, a portly man with shifty eyes, named a sum that was both an insult and an impossibility for most. Josiah didn't haggle. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, met Ilara's for a fleeting, unreadable moment. He reached into a worn leather pouch, $3 silver, he said, his voice even, betraying nothing. He laid the coins on the rough-hewn plank of the makeshift auction stand. Then, he did something that sent a tremor through Ilara, something that caused a collective gasp to ripple through the onlookers. He drew off a simple, battered band from his own finger, an old wedding ring, its gold dulled with time and wear, and placed it beside the silver. And this, the merchant, momentarily stunned by the unexpected nature of the final offering, quickly gathered the coins and the ring. The transaction, brutal in its simplicity, was done. Ownership, such as it was, had passed. Josiah's gaze rested on Caleb, then lifted to Ilara. "Come," he said, the single word not a command, but a quiet statement. He led them away from the gaping crowd, toward a wagon laden with supplies that spoke of a journey. Ilara walked beside him, Caleb's small hand now clutched tightly in hers. The silence between them was vast, filled with the unspoken weight of years, of promises broken and a life fractured. She was his now, bought and paid for, a transaction that echoed the vows they had once made. Only this time, there was no love, only the stark reality of survival, or so she thought. The journey to his high country cabin was arduous. The air grew thin and cold as they ascended, the landscape transforming from dusty plains to snow-dusted pines. Josiah handled the team with a practiced hand, his movements efficient, his words few. He offered them food, a warm blanket for Caleb, his consideration a strange counterpoint to the cold knot of apprehension in Alara's belly. He was kind, yet distant, a wall of reserve around him that she could not penetrate. He asked nothing of her, made no demands, his respect for her person a silent offering that was, in its own way, more unsettling than any overt claim. The cabin, when they reached it, was small, a sturdy but solitary sentinel against the encroaching wilderness. Snow lay deep around it, the silence profound, broken only by the sigh of the wind through the skeletal branches of aspen trees. Inside, a fire was soon crackling in the stone hearth. Josiah's movements, economical and sure as he brought in supplies, settled the horses, and made the small space habitable. He gave Alara and Caleb the single built-in bunk. Taking a bedroll for himself by the fire, he spoke to Caleb gently, his voice softer than Alara remembered, and the boy, after days of clinging to his mother, slowly began to uncurl, his childish curiosity peeking through his fear. "Why did you do it, Josiah?" Alara finally asked one evening, the words escaping her before she could call them back. They sat in the dim light of the fire, Caleb asleep in the bunk, the wind a low moan outside. Josiah looked up from the piece of leather he was mending, his face shadowed. He shouldn't have. No man should sell his kin like that. His voice was rough. And Caleb, he deserves better. And me. The question was barely a whisper. His gaze met hers, steady and searching. "You deserve better, too. Alara." He looked back at his mending. "I ain't askin' for nothin'. You're free to go when the snow's clear. If that's your wish, I'll see you and the boy to a real town. Help you get settled. Freedom." The word should have been a balm, but it felt complicated. She didn't trust him. How could she? The past was a chasm between them, filled with hurt and misunderstanding. Yet, his actions spoke a different language than the bitter memories she carried. He treated her not as property, but as a person, with a quiet deference that chipped away at her hardened resolve. He chopped wood, hauled water, hunted for their food, his presence a constant, unobtrusive shield against the harshness of their circumstances. He shared his meager comforts without expectation, his empathy a silent current that flowed between them in the shared quiet of the small cabin. There were evenings when Caleb, emboldened by Josiah's patient kindness, would ask for a story. Josiah, surprisingly, would oblige, his voice rumbling deep as he spun simple tales of brave animals or wily coyotes, his eyes often straying to Alara, a flicker of something old and familiar in their depths. In those moments, watching the firelight play on his face, the harsh lines softened. Alara felt a stirring of something other than fear or resentment. It was a fragile thing, easily startled. Like a doe at the edge of a clearing, she remembered the ring, his ring, the one she had once placed on his finger, full of hope, the one he had used to buy her freedom from another man. The irony was a bitter draught. The ring, Josiah, she found herself saying one night, her voice barely audible above the crackle of the flames. "Why did you give it up?" He set aside the knife he was sharpening, the steel gleaming in the firelight. He was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames as if seeking an answer there. "It didn't mean what it was supposed to anymore," he said finally, his voice low and gravelly. "Not for a long time." He paused, then added, so quietly she almost didn't hear, Maybe it could mean something different now. Something about starting over. Not for them." He gestured vaguely, perhaps towards the town, the world that had discarded her. But for us? For Caleb? He didn't look at her, but the unspoken hung in the air. He wasn't asking for forgiveness, not demanding a reconciliation. He was merely offering a possibility, as stark and as real as the cabin walls around them. Ilara said nothing. The silence stretched, filled only with the sounds of the wilderness and the sleeping breath of her child. She didn't trust the feeling that was slowly, cautiously, unfurling within her. It felt too much like hope, and hope had proven a cruel master in the past. Yet, as she watched him, his profile etched against the fire's glow, a man who had every right to be bitter, to be distant, offering instead a quiet, steady kindness. A different kind of warmth began to seep into the frozen corners of her heart. Trust hadn't been earned yet, not fully, but in the deep silence of that snowbound cabin, with the weight of her past and the uncertainty of her future pressing in, a fragile thread of empathy, spun from shared glances and unspoken words, began to weave itself between them. He asked for nothing, and in that, he was perhaps offering everything. Josiah's quiet words about the ring, about a different kind of beginning, settled into the cabin's stillness, as profound and unsettling as the vast, snow-covered wilderness outside. Ilara didn't reply immediately. His offer, so devoid of demand, so freighted with a past they both carried like a shared burden, was too momentous for easy words. The fire popped, a log shifting, casting flickering shadows that danced like the ghosts of their former lives. She looked at Caleb, sleeping soundly, his small face peaceful in the dim light, a testament to the fragile security Josiah had painstakingly built around them. Days turned into weeks, marked by the rhythm of survival and the slow thaw of distrust. The heavy snows of the high country kept them cocooned, a world unto themselves. It was in this enforced intimacy, with the wind howling its lonely song beyond their sturdy walls, that the stories of their separate griefs began to emerge, not in a flood, but in hesitant trickles, like meltwater seeking a new path. One evening, while mending a tear in Caleb's small coat, Ilara's needle stilled. "I lost a child once before," she said, her voice so low Josiah had to strain to hear it above the crackle of the hearth. A girl. She was fragile. The cold took her. The winter after Caleb was born. My former husband." The words were like stones in her mouth. "He said it was a weakness in my blood." The cruelty of it, stark and unadorned, hung in the air. She didn't speak of the daily humiliations, the casual brutality that followed, culminating in the shame of the auction block. The loss of her daughter was the deepest cut, the one that had bled the life from her long before Josiah found her. Josiah stopped his work, whittling a small figure for Caleb. He didn't offer platitudes, didn't try to diminish her pain. He simply listened, his silence a vessel for her sorrow. When she finally fell silent, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek, he said, his own voice thick with an old ache, "I had a wife and a son, little Ben." He paused, the name a raw wound. "Fever took them both, a spring ago, before I Drifted here. 1 week. They were fine. The next, he didn't finish. The desolation in his eyes saying more than words ever could. After that, the world didn't seem to hold much purpose. His confession, mirroring her own loss, forged a new, somber link between them. They were two souls adrift, each having navigated the darkest waters of grief, each having thought themselves irrevocably lost. Now, in this isolated cabin, their shared pain became a quiet understanding, a common ground upon which something tentative, something akin to solace, might be built. The tasks of their days became small acts of reconstruction. Josiah would chop wood. The rhythmic thud of the axe, a steady heartbeat against the silence of the snows. And Ilara would often find herself watching him, the surety of his movements a comfort. She took to knitting, her needles clicking softly as she fashioned tiny garments for the child growing within her, an act of faith in a future she hadn't dared to imagine. He'd show Caleb how to set simple snares, or point out animal tracks in the snow. His patience with the boy, a constant, gentle presence. They cleaned the cabin together, a shared tending of their small haven. Sometimes, in the evenings, Ilara would tell Josiah stories of Caleb as a baby, small, cherished memories, and he, in turn, would share a funny anecdote about his own Ben, the pain softened by the passage of time and the act of remembrance. The air in the cabin, once thick with unspoken hurts and wary distances, began to clear. Laughter, tentative at first, then more frequent, especially from Caleb, began to echo off the rough-hewn walls. Ilara found herself anticipating Josiah's quiet smile, the rare moments when his eyes would meet hers with a warmth that went beyond mere kindness. The wall of her reserve hadn't crumbled, but cracks were appearing, letting in small, hesitant rays of light. Then, weeks before her time, the baby decided to arrive. A storm blew in with sudden fury, the wind shrieking like a banshee, rattling the shutters and driving snow against the cabin in blinding sheets. Ilara's pains began with the storm's first assault, sharp and urgent. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her. It was too soon. Josiah, seeing her face pale, her hands clutch her belly, was instantly by her side. "Ilara, what is it?" "The baby," she gasped, a wave of pain washing over her. "It's coming." Too early. Panic flickered in Josiah's eyes, but he banked it down, his voice steadying. All right, Ilara. We'll manage. Just breathe. Tell me what to do." He moved with a swiftness and purpose that belied any fear. He stoked the fire high, put water on to boil. His hands, usually so calloused from outdoor work, surprisingly gentle as he helped her to the bunk. Caleb, awakened by the commotion and frightened by the storm's fury and his mother's cries, began to weep. Josiah spared a moment to kneel by the boy. "Hey, little man," he said softly, his voice a calm anchor in the maelstrom. "Your mama needs to be brave right now, and so do you. Can you be brave for her? I need you to be my big helper and stay quiet by the fire." He tucked the boy in with an extra blanket, his own old coat, before turning back to Ilara. The night was a blur of pain for Ilara, of the howling wind and Josiah's constant, reassuring presence. He was there, wiping her brow, murmuring encouragement, his hand strong and capable as he followed her strained instructions. He was clumsy at times, fear etched on his face in the lamplight, but he never faltered, never left her side. There was no room for modesty, no space for past grievances. There was only the raw, elemental struggle for life. In the darkest hour, as the storm raged its peak, their child was born. A tiny, wailing girl, frighteningly small, but blessedly alive. Josiah, his face slick with sweat, his hands trembling slightly, carefully cleaned the infant and wrapped her in the softest linen Ilara had, his movements imbued with a tenderness that made Ilara's heart ache. "A girl, Ilara," he whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion as he laid the bundled infant in her arms. A beautiful little girl, exhausted. Ilara could only nod, tears of relief and a welter of other, unnameable emotions streaming down her face. She looked at Josiah, truly looked at him, and saw not the stranger who had bought her, nor the ghost of her past, but a man who had stood by her, fought for her and her child, his face alight with a fierce, protective tenderness. He didn't just deliver the baby. Through the rest of that long night and the days that followed, while Ilara recovered her strength, Josiah cared for them both, and for Caleb. He soothed the crying infant, his large, rough hands surprisingly adept. He cooked, cleaned, and kept the fire roaring, his energy seeming inexhaustible. He drew Caleb into the fold, showing him his new sister, talking to him about being a big brother, his interactions with the boy now possessing an effortless intimacy, the easy affection of a father. Caleb, in turn, shadowed Josiah's every move, his earlier fear replaced by a quiet adoration. Watching Josiah with her son, seeing his gentle care for their newborn daughter, Ilara felt the last of her defenses begin to truly crumble. The respect and empathy that had slowly taken root in the frozen ground of their shared isolation were now blossoming into something far deeper, something that felt perilously like trust, and perhaps even the fragile beginnings of love. Reborn amidst the storms of the past and the present, he had asked for nothing. Yet in his unwavering support, in his steadfast presence, he had become everything. The weeks that followed the birth of their daughter, whom Ilara, with a glance towards Josiah that sought and received his quiet nod, named Grace, settled into a rhythm of tender domesticity. The tiny infant, a fragile miracle nurtured by their combined efforts, became the quiet sun around which their small world now revolved. Josiah's hands, so capable in felling trees or calming a spooked horse, were equally gentle in cradling Grace, his deep voice often humming a tuneless lullaby that nevertheless soothed her. Caleb, no longer the fearful child who had clung to his mother's skirts, blossomed under Josiah's patient tutelage, a small, sturdy shadow mimicking Josiah's chores, his laughter echoing freely in the mountain air when they played their rough-and-tumble games. Ilara watched them, a profound peace unfurling within her, a peace she had believed forever lost. The cabin, once a mere shelter, had become a home, imbued with the warmth of shared tasks, whispered confidences, and the unspoken language of growing affection. Josiah asked for nothing, yet he gave everything: his strength, his protection, his unwavering tenderness. The memory of the auction block, of the life before, began to recede, softened by the daily balm of kindness and the burgeoning hope for a future she now dared to envision at his side. But the past, Ilara was to learn, had a long and bitter reach. It was a late spring morning, the last vestiges of snow melting under a strengthening sun, when the unwelcome intrusion came. Two men on horseback rode into their clearing, their town clothes and stiff demeanors starkly out of place in the wild, untamed beauty of Josiah's high country haven. Ilara, hanging freshly washed baby linens on a line strung between two pines, felt a familiar chill snake down her spine even before they dismounted. Josiah emerged from the cabin, an axe in his hand, his body instantly alert. Placing himself between Ilara and the newcomers, Caleb, who had been playing near the woodpile, ran to Josiah's side, his small hand gripping his trouser leg. "Josiah Coulter," one of the men asked, his voice devoid of warmth. He was older, with a self-important air and a badge pinned unevenly to his vest. The other was younger, looking uncomfortable. "I'm Coulter," Josiah affirmed, his voice calm but firm, his eyes missing nothing. "This is private property. We're here on official business," the older man announced, pulling a folded document from his coat pocket. "Got a complaint filed by a Mr. Silas Blackwood, down in Redemption Creek. Claims you're unlawfully harboring his wife, Ilara Blackwood, and his son, Caleb." He unfolded the paper with a flourish. "This here is a legal demand for the return of the boy, Caleb Blackwood. Seems there's no record of any legal marriage between you and the woman, making your custody of the child irregular, to say the least." Ilara's blood ran cold. Silas, her former husband, the man who had sold them, the audacity, the cruelty of his claim, struck her dumb. She felt Caleb tremble against Josiah's leg. Josiah's jaw tightened, but his voice remained even. "Ilara is not his wife. He sold her, in public, along with the boy. I paid his price. A distasteful transaction, perhaps," the man conceded with a slight sneer. "But Mr. Blackwood contends he was under duress, and that the sale, particularly of a child, holds no legal standing. He has papers, a marriage certificate to the woman, and the boy is his legal issue. You, Mr. Coulter, have no such claim on the boy." He gestured towards Caleb. "We're here to take the child." Fear, sharp and sickening, clawed at Ilara. To lose Caleb now, after everything. It was unthinkable. She saw the lawman's eyes, cold and unyielding, the younger one looking away, clearly distressed by the task. The paper in the man's hand seemed to hold all the power, a cruel testament to a world where humanity often came second to brittle legality. Josiah stepped forward, the axe still held loosely, a silent warning. "This boy stays here. This woman stays here. This is their home." His voice was low, resonant with a conviction that brooked no argument. "This is a house built on kindness, on looking after one another. Your papers." He gestured dismissively towards the document. "They don't know the meaning of what makes a family, fate and heart and human decency. Those are the laws we live by here. Those aren't the laws that hold sway in a courtroom." "Coulter," the older man retorted, his hand inching towards the pistol at his hip. "Now, are you going to hand over the boy, or are we going to have trouble?" Ilara saw the flash of fury in Josiah's eyes, the tightening of his grip on the axe. He would fight. He would die before letting them take Caleb, and he would be arrested, or worse, and she, and Caleb, and tiny Grace would be left to the mercy of Silas Blackwood. The thought was a vice around her heart. "No," she choked out, stepping forward, her voice trembling but resolute. "Don't, Josiah." She turned to the lawman, her face a mask of desperate composure. If I go with you, will you leave Caleb? For now, just until things can be sorted properly." It was a lie, a desperate bid for time, a willingness to sacrifice herself, She couldn't let Josiah throw his life away. She would take Caleb and Grace and disappear into the wilderness if she had to. Josiah's head whipped around, his eyes wide with disbelief and a pain that mirrored her own. "Elara, no, we're here for the boy." "Ma'am," the older lawman said, his tone unwavering. "His father wants him." Tears streamed down Elara's face. She felt the world collapsing. She bent down to Caleb, her heart shattering. "Caleb, my love." But Josiah moved, his hand gently on her arm, stopping her. He turned back to the lawman, his face carved from granite. "You want papers?" he said, his voice ringing with sudden, fierce resolve. "You want a legal claim." He reached into his pocket, not for a weapon, but for the small clasp knife he always carried. Then, with swift, deliberate movements, he sliced a thin, even loop from the leather reins hanging beside the cabin door. His fingers, surprisingly deft, worked for a moment longer, fashioning a crude but distinct toggle from a small piece of kindling. A tiny wooden hook. He knelt before Elara, ignoring the stunned lawmen, ignoring everything but the woman before him, her face streaked with tears, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and dawning understanding. He held out the simple leather loop, with its tiny wooden hook meant to fasten it. It was no gold band, no jeweler's creation. It was a ring born of the moment, of necessity, of the very fabric of their hard-won life together. "Elara," his voice was rough with emotion, raw and true. "I know this ain't fancy. I know I ain't much. But what I have, what I am, it's yours. It's been yours for longer than I knew." He looked up at her, his gaze stripping away all pretense, all doubt. "Marry me. Elara, be my wife. Let me be a father to Caleb and to Grace." In the eyes of God, and any man who dares question it, he didn't plead. He simply offered his heart, his life, his name. Elara stared at the humble offering in his calloused palm, then into his eyes, eyes that held a love so profound, so steadfast, it stole her breath. This man, who had bought her from degradation, who had sheltered her, who had delivered her child and cherished her son as his own, this man, who was willing to stand against the world for them. Tears still flowed, but now they were tears of overwhelming love, of a hope so fierce it burned away the last vestiges of fear. She reached out a trembling hand, not for the ring, but to cup his face. "Oh, Josiah," she whispered, her voice breaking. Then, with a conviction that matched his own, a certainty that settled deep in her soul, she said, "Yes, yes, I'll marry you." Josiah's face transformed, a slow smile spreading, lighting him from within. He slipped the leather loop onto her finger, the wooden hook catching to secure it. It fit as if it were always meant to be there. He rose, taking her hand, and turned to face the two lawmen, who stood gaping, their official order momentarily forgotten in the face of such a raw, unexpected declaration. "She is my betrothed," Josiah stated, his voice clear and strong, leaving no room for doubt. "And these," he gestured to Caleb, who was now beaming, and towards the cabin where Grace slept, "are my children. We will be married by the first preacher who passes this way. Now, unless you have business with my family that doesn't involve tearing it apart, I suggest you be on your way." He looked at Elara then, a lifetime of devotion in his eyes, and said softly, "For her alone, I have belonged to you for a long, long time. Elara, this just makes it known. What did you think of today's story? If it made your day, Drop a good in the comments. If it didn't hit the mark, just type 1. Got your own thoughts? I'd love to hear them below. And hey, don't forget to hit subscribe. It's free, and it really helps the channel grow. Thank you so much for being here. The two lawmen, clearly discomfited by the raw honesty of Josiah's proposal and Ilara's heartfelt acceptance, mumbled something about needing to consult further and retreated, their official document seeming somewhat less potent in the face of such elemental human commitment. A fragile peace settled over the high country cabin, yet it was a peace underscored by a taut awareness. Silas Blackwood was not a man to be easily thwarted. Josiah and Ilara spoke little of the lawmen's visit, but it hung in the air. They began to make quiet plans, not for flight, but for a life. Josiah rode out once, returning with word that an itinerant preacher was expected in the valley settlement in a month's time. Their wedding would be simple, witnessed by the mountains, and, they hoped, a few friendly souls from the sparsely populated area. The leather ring on Ilara's finger felt more precious than any gold, but their brief respite was shattered less than a fortnight later. A rider, clearly paid for his haste and discretion, left a crudely scrawled letter wedged in the cabin door. It was from Silas. He'd found them. The words were venomous, filled with threats to reclaim what is mine by law and by God, and included a roughly drawn, entirely fraudulent-looking summons demanding Ilara and Caleb appear before a non-existent magistrate. "He won't stop, Josiah," Ilara whispered, the paper trembling in her hand, the old fear coiling in her stomach. Grace, sensing her mother's distress, began to fuss in her cradle. Josiah's face was grim. "No," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Men like him, they only understand one thing." He looked out at the vast wilderness that had been their sanctuary. "We need to be ready." He didn't have to wait long. Just days later, as dusk was painting the sky in hues of bruised purple and fiery orange, Silas Blackwood returned, and he did not come alone. With him were 3 hard-bitten men, the kind whose guns were worn with familiarity, their faces etched with the harsh lines of lives lived on the violent fringes. They rode in not with the caution of lawmen, but with the brazen arrogance of marauders. The first warning was the panicked neighing of their mare, followed by the acrid smell of smoke. The stable, Josiah yelled, already moving, grabbing his rifle from its pegs above the door. "Ilara, get the children. To the forest. The old trapper's hollow. You remember the way." Flames licked at the small log stable, casting grotesque, dancing shadows. Blackwood and his men were whooping, firing their pistols into the air, riding around the small homestead, smashing the few outbuildings, a chicken coop, a woodshed, with brutal abandon. Ilara, her heart hammering against her ribs, bundled a crying Grace and grabbed a terrified Caleb's hand. Josiah laid down covering fire, his shots precise, aimed not to kill, but to deter, to buy them precious seconds. "Go, now," he urged, his face a mask of grim determination. She fled into the deepening twilight, scrambling through the familiar woods. Grace clutched tight, Caleb stumbling beside her. The sounds of destruction, of Blackwood's taunting shouts, followed them like predatory beasts. Josiah, after ensuring his family had a head start, retreated skillfully, using the terrain he knew like the back of his hand. He met them at the hidden entrance to the snow hollow, a deep, sheltered depression he'd discovered in his solitary years, almost invisible beneath a tumble of rocks and overgrown brush. Their sanctuary was cold, damp, Their only provisions were a small sack of jerky and dried fruit Josiah had managed to grab. For 3 days, they huddled there, listening to the distant sounds of Blackwood's men sporadically searching, their voices filled with drunken frustration. The nights were the worst. The cold seeped into their bones, and Grace, already fragile from her premature birth, developed a raging fever. Her small body burned, her whimpers weak and pitiful. Elara, watching her baby struggle, felt a despair so profound it threatened to swallow her whole. "I have to go back, Josiah," she sobbed, her voice raw with anguish, as she tried to cool Grace's brow with a damp cloth. "I'll give myself up. I'll tell Silas he can have whatever he wants if he just gets her to a doctor." Josiah gathered her close, his own face etched with worry, but his resolve unshakable. "No, Elara." His voice was fierce, yet tender. "You'll do no such thing. No one has the right to reclaim what he has thrown away, what he has abused and discarded. We don't bow to animals like him. Grace will pull through. You'll keep her warm. I'll find us a way." And he did. On the 3rd night, under the cover of a moonless sky, Josiah slipped away. Elara waited in an agony of fear, but just before dawn, he returned, not alone. With him was Samuel Merrick, a grizzled, respected rancher from the lower valley, a man known for his quiet wisdom and unshakable integrity. An old friend of Josiah's from years past. "Samuel will help us," Josiah said simply. "He's seen what Blackwood has done. He'll gather others. Bear witness." Merrick nodded, his eyes filled with a grim understanding as he looked at the family's plight. At the sick child, he left as silently as he came, a promise of action in his steadfast gaze. When they finally dared to return to their homestead, after Merrick confirmed Blackwood and his men had ridden off, presumably back to Redemption Creek, the sight was devastating. The stable was a smoldering ruin, their few animals gone or scattered, their small, cultivated patch trampled. But the cabin, miraculously, still stood. Josiah didn't waste time. With Merrick's backing, and the testimony of a few other settlers who had seen the smoke or heard the commotion, and later found evidence of Blackwood's rampage, he rode into Redemption Creek. He didn't go seeking vengeance with a gun. He went seeking justice, petitioning the circuit judge for a public hearing. The small town buzzed with anticipation. Silas Blackwood, a man who had always operated with bluster and intimidation, now found himself summoned to answer for his actions. The makeshift courtroom, the town's meeting hall, was packed. Villagers stood shoulder to shoulder, their faces a mixture of curiosity and, as the evidence unfolded, growing outrage. Josiah stood tall, Elara at his side, holding Grace, while Caleb sat solemnly beside Samuel Merrick in the front row. The evidence was laid out, piece by painstaking piece. Merrick and 2 other ranchers testified to the destruction at Josiah's homestead, the deliberate cruelty of the act. Josiah presented the charred remains of a unique horse blanket, clearly identifiable, found near the burned stable, a blanket known to belong to one of Blackwood's hired guns. Then, with quiet dignity, Josiah produced the original bill of sale, written in Blackwood's own hand, for 1 woman, Elara, and 1 boy child, Caleb, purchased for $3 silver and a wedding ring. A gasp went through the crowd as the crude document was read aloud. Elara, her voice trembling but clear, recounted the terror of the attack, the desperate flight, and the hardship that led to Grace's life-threatening fever. A doctor from a neighboring settlement, fetched by Merrick, testified to the baby's critical condition upon their return, directly linking it to exposure and malnutrition endured during their forced hiding. Blackwood, blustering and arrogant at first, grew increasingly agitated as the weight of evidence mounted against him. His hired guns, seeing the mood of the court turn, began to look nervously at each other. The verdict, when it came, was swift and decisive. Silas Blackwood was found guilty of assault, of the endangerment of a child, of the willful destruction of property, and, in a landmark decision for that rough territory, of trafficking in persons based on his own bill of sale. He was sentenced to a long term of hard labor. His 3 accomplices, facing their own charges, quickly offered testimony against Blackwood in exchange for lesser sentences. As Josiah and Alara left the hall, the townspeople, who had once perhaps looked upon them with suspicion or indifference, now parted to let them pass, their faces showing a newfound respect, even admiration. They had seen a family refuse to be broken, a quiet man and a resilient woman stand up against brutality and demand justice, in a land where too often silence and fear held sway. Walking into the sunlight, Alara felt the leather ring on her finger. It was more than a promise now. It was a testament. They had faced the worst, and they had not only survived, but they had, together, brought a measure of true law to the wild heart of the West. Their small cabin in the high country, once a refugee, would now truly be a home, built not just on kindness, but on courage and an unbreakable love. The dust of the courtroom barely settled before a new kind of order began to take root in Josiah and Alara's lives. The circuit judge, moved by their story and the clear evidence of their commitment, formally recognized Josiah as the legal father to Caleb, and, with a warm smile towards the infant in Alara's arms, to the baby girl as well, their marriage, pledged with a leather loop and a wooden hook, was duly registered, the simple vows they'd spoken in the cabin now carrying the weight of law. Their small homestead, the site of so much turmoil, was finally, unequivocally, theirs, legally protected, a sanctuary hard won. They had called her Grace in those first fragile weeks after her stormy birth, a whispered prayer of thanks for her survival. But now, as they stood on the threshold of a life truly their own, a life wrested from the jaws of despair, a new name felt more fitting, a name that spoke not just of divine mercy, but of the resilient human spirit that had carried them through their darkest days. Hope, for she was born, Alara would often say, her voice soft with remembered hardship and present joy, when we dared not believe hope was possible anymore. And so, the infant Grace became hope, a living symbol of their new beginning. With the legal battles behind them, they turned their energies to rebuilding, not just their farm, but their future. The burned-out stable was the first to rise again, sturdier this time. Built with timber, Josiah felled himself, Alara often nearby with baby Hope slung securely, Caleb helping by fetching smaller pieces of wood or handing Josiah tools. They cleared the trampled garden, and Alara, with a newfound lightness in her heart, planted rows of vegetables, her hands finding solace in the rich earth. Together, they drew up plans for a small kitchen extension, a lean-to where Alara could cook without the cabin growing too hot in the summer. And Josiah expanded the porch, making it wide enough for them to sit in the evenings, watching the sunset paint the high peaks. Caleb, his small face serious with concentration, resumed his lessons with Alara, learning his letters and numbers. the shadow of his past fear slowly receding, replaced by the bright curiosity of a boy secure in his world. Hope thrived, a chubby, gurgling baby, bathed in the love of her parents and her adoring older brother. One cool spring morning, Josiah brought home a slender sapling, its roots carefully wrapped in burlap. "An apple tree," he announced, a rare, broad smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. Together, they planted it in the cleared space before the newly expanded porch, a solitary promise of future bounty. As they tamped the earth around its base, Josiah looked at Elara, his gaze deep and steady. "If anyone ever finds themselves lost out here, searching for a good place," he said, his voice imbued with a quiet conviction, "we'll tell them to look for this tree. We'll tell them this is where something good began, where kindness took root. The community, which had borne witness to their trial and their triumph, began to thaw." The first tentative gesture was a small pot of wild honey left on their doorstep. No note, just the sweet offering. Then, a neighboring rancher, ostensibly passing by, stopped to offer a spare shovel and an hour of his time helping Josiah mend a section of fence. Slowly, the averted gazes in Redemption Creek's general store turned into hesitant nods, then into quiet greetings. Elara found herself exchanging recipes with another homesteader's wife, and Caleb was invited to join a group of children for a fishing trip down by the creek. They were no longer outsiders, but a part of the fabric of the valley. Their story, a quiet legend of resilience and justice. Life settled into a peaceful rhythm, marked by the changing seasons and the steady growth of their children and their farm. Each morning, before starting his day's work, Josiah would walk out to the young apple tree. He'd often lay his hand, or sometimes the smooth, worn wood of his axe handle, against its slender trunk for a moment, a silent communion. Elara, watching from the cabin doorway, knew what that gesture meant. It was his daily reminder, to himself, to the whispering winds we survived, and we chose to love. 20 years slid by, as seasons turn, each layering onto the last, enriching the soil of their lives. Hope Farm, as their place came to be known, flourished. The small cabin had grown with their family, extensions added like loving arms embracing its core. The single apple tree was now magnificent, its branches gnarled with age but heavy with fruit each autumn, its shade a welcome respite in the summer heat. Caleb was a fine young man, his father's quiet strength mirrored in his steady gaze, working the land alongside Josiah. Hope, with her mother's gentle eyes and her father's resilient spirit, was the valley's beloved schoolteacher. One crisp autumn afternoon, the laughter of children echoed across Hope Farm. Miss Hope Coulter was leading her students from the village school on their annual fall nature tour. They explored the well-tended orchards, peered into the bustling barns, and listened with wide eyes as Hope explained the workings of the farm. Josiah, his hair now silvered, his face a roadmap of a life well lived, sat on the wide porch, Elara beside him, her hand resting comfortably in his. They watched the children, a familiar warmth spreading through them. A small girl, no older than 7, with bright, curious eyes and pigtails the color of corn silk, broke away from the group and approached the porch shyly. She looked up at Josiah, her head tilted. "Mr. Coulter, sir," she ventured, her voice small. "Yes, little one." Josiah's smile was kind. "Miss Hope is the best teacher," the girl declared. Then, with the innocent directness of childhood, she asked, "Where did you meet Mrs. Coulter? Where did you meet Miss Hope's mama?" Josiah's gaze drifted from the child to Elara. a lifetime of love passing between them in that single glance. Then, he turned his eyes towards the magnificent apple tree, its leaves a blaze of gold and crimson in the afternoon sun, its branches laden with ripe fruit. A soft, reminiscent smile touched his lips. "Well now," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble tinged with the sweet nostalgia of a cherished memory. "That was a long time ago, but I reckon it was right here, right next to this old tree." Ilara's hand tightened on his, and she leaned her head against his shoulder. The tree stood, a silent, leafy witness to a love that had not only survived the harshest of storms, but had taken root, blossomed, and borne the sweetest fruit. What did this story stir in you? Was it the quiet strength of a man who didn't ask for trust but earned it anyway? Was it the resilience of a woman sold like property, but who learned to plant hope again? Or maybe it was the moment a little boy found someone to call Pa without being told to. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below. Tell us what part stayed with you long after the fire burned low. And if you want more stories like this of survival, redemption, and homes built from mercy, subscribe to the channel. There's more coming, and you won't want to miss the next ride. See y'all down the trail.